alias is Sherry. My English alias is Sherry Copenace. So I've been asked to share a little bit about blood memory. But before I before I do that, for those of you that might not know, um, diabetes has really impacted my people tremendously, and I won't say, and it hasn't been in a good way. Hasn't been in a good way. When I was younger, I used to wonder about this ailment, and I didn't realize how damaging it could be, yeah, how it could even lead to death, and it even opened my eyes even more when I realized and seen the data, the statistics, and the real life stories, like the narratives, of our children and our youth being affected by it, being caught by that, and how they can be just young, like 6 years old, and so our children have I think they have like a double rate of getting it than other children, but the scientists will maybe speak to that more. But for me, I see the real life stories on that, eh? I see the real life stories on that. So for me, as John mentioned, that was brought to us through colonization, what we call, when different foreign things are brought to us, foreign things like foreign foods, things that are put into the environment, even um, us being like the most marginalized and most impoverished people in Canada. So that affects that's direct result of colonization. That's a direct result, and to me, it's really had a devastating impact on us as a people. But the other part to that, the balance that we talk about is, despite that, we know we can obtain healing and wellness, healing and wellness. We know that, and that's what I'm going to share here a little bit, because for me, it's not the story that I want to share is not about doom and gloom. What I want to share is the story of hope, the story of wellness, the story of balance, and how we can all achieve that for our children and ultimately our whole society, the society that we all live in. And I know that Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can work together to make that happen so that can come to fruition. So that's what I'm going to speak about today. Um, if I can get this thing to work.
Yeah, if you request again to control the
Okay.
slides, that will get it going.
Okay. So thanks for being patient with me. So I'm gonna go and try and do this. I have some screens here that I'm trying to work, but it's not working for me. Oh, there it is. So these first two photos that you see here, the first one is what DNA looks like. Our non-indigenous scientists, doctors, people that that study DNA, they must have took a photo of DNA, and this is how it looks. It looks like, if you could see it 3D, it twirls around like this, and it has little lines in between it. So that's a picture of DNA. That's what's inside of all of us. All of us. Everything that's alive has that. Everything. And each one of us as human beings have our own unique DNA within us, our own unique DNA. And for us, we call that blood memory. We call that blood memory. When I was younger, I used to wonder what that was. And I'll speak a little bit about what that, but what I was basically told by the older people, the people, my teachers, of all ages across the lifespan, but this one was taught to me by the older people. They said that I carry everything from creation, when creation was first made, like when Earth was being made, when the universe, when the stars, when the sky, when the waters, um, the air, all of that is within my blood memory. And even my human ancestors, all of that is within me. So for me, I always focus on the strengths of my ancestors, focus on the strengths of creation, because that's my blood memory. That's my blood memory. And in that blood memory, it has the potential for me to achieve healing and wellness, to go back to that state of wellness. And the second photo that you see here is myself, my sister, my two nieces, my granddaughter, and my daughter at the end. We all made our own cradle boards, tikanagan, tikanagan. And to us, that's a representation of blood memory. When you look at that, tikanagan, and we all, me, my daughter, and my granddaughter made one. Maybe my great grandchild will be in the one that we made one day. My granddaughter is the second one from the right there. And if you're able to see the lacing of a tikanagan, it's it's like this DNA. If you could see it 3D, it the lacing goes like this. And we say that when we were being gifted this tikanagan, this cradle board, it was a reminder of our blood memory. It was a reminder of our genetic memory that and we would see that when we placed our children, when we placed our babies in here, to remind us of that blood memory that we carry and that our babies carry. And so I have it, my ancestors have it, I have it, and my descendants have that. And to me, I always focus on the strengths of that. So it's not by chance that our lacing is like this, eh? It's uh, it's a symbol. Today's a material symbol of our DNA. So that's why I wanted to show this photo. It's still very much alive, still very much alive with us. Then the next I wanted to talk about is blood memory. So I often had what people call deja vu, and I used to often wonder about that. And then I was told that's my blood memory kicking in, because I would, at that exact moment, something would happen and I know it's all good, what's all going to transpire from there. But I know that was my first time experiencing as this human. So I was told that's my blood memory. And for us as Anishinaabe, we think of time from the past, present, and future. It's all intertwined like that. It's not like how it is clock that we see today. It's not like Sunday to Saturday. It's all intertwined in that way, just like blood memory. You know how those connections go. So I asked, what do we call that? And they said we call, in our language, we call it a noteziwan, which is the links and connections across our whole lifespan. It's ancestral to our descendants. So that's a noteziwan, what we call, what some people would call deja vu. Those things really happened. My ancestors experienced it, I experienced it, and now my descendants will. So that's what we call blood memory. So, right again, it goes right back to creation. Blood memory is also our holistic connection. And what I mean by holistic is our spirit, our emotions, our mind, and our body. So that's what I mean by our holistic connection. It's not one, it's not only one, it's all four of those. And it's our holistic connection to our spirituality, to our lands, to our waters, to our language, to our songs, to our teachings, and much, much more. It's about our whole way of life. It's also the happiness we feel when we're around those ways. Because as you know, colonization did their best to cut that off for us, to disrupt that for us. But even though that happened, we have a resurgence now wherever all Indigenous people really want to know who they are. And what I always say is, as adults, as helpers, as carers, we need to give every opportunity for Indigenous children to have every opportunity to access who all of these connections to who they are, to have every opportunity to experience and live that. Blood memory is also crucial to the existence of our way of life, and I put in brackets culture because sometimes people think, well, what does that mean, way of life? It's everything in our culture that I just spoke to, or it's the four parts of me, my spirit, my heart, my mind, and my body, but it's also the sacred connection I have to that spiritual realm and those spiritual beings, the land, water, songs, and teachings. It's also about wellness. I was told, even though we experience trauma and have ailments like diabetes, when we activate our blood memory through living and being around our ways, it can heal that. It can heal that. And one grandma, this is what she said to me: think of this as that ailment. And when you activate your blood memory, it'll smooth out that bump. It'll smooth it out. It might not entirely get rid of it, but it'll smooth it out. And I said, well, how do we activate our blood memory? Me being a young, inquisitive, sometimes foolish young woman. And she said, it's as simple as walking upon the land. It's as simple as taking a drink of that water. It's as simple as saying your Anishinaabe name, Nijosek. That'll activate your blood memory. So that's blood memory. Oh, and I put that pic. Oh, so the origin and roots. Um, so where it all comes from, the foundation, right comes from the teachings of creation, and some people call it stories, eh? But I try to stay away from that word because sometimes people think about fairy tales when I say stories, but it's not. This actually happened. So our teachings of creation actually happened. My ancestors experienced that. And fast forward to today, we still remember those teachings of creation. So it's right from Creator, that good and kind hearted spirit, how we were created, and then everything in between, like the plant life, the animal, the waters, the earth, and then to us, the last being that were created as human beings. And everything in between is rich with Anishinaabe science. That's all science to us, all of that. So that's why it's really critical for us to know our teachings of creation because we're part of that. And we also know that those teachings contain sacred knowledge because it comes directly from that spiritual realm, from that sacred realm, from Creator and all of those spiritual beings. So that's my blood memory. That's my blood memory. And we also know that the environment and life experiences can suppress that. But when we have can suppress or alter the expression of our inherent gifts of the Creator, which is carried in our DNA. We know that. Like some people call it trauma, some people call it diabetes, any other illness. But we also know that it's possible to heal these negative changes and return to a state of wellness by living our Anishinaabe way of life. And I've shared with you what how we can possibly do that, how we can activate our blood memory. And that's I just want to share this photo because to me that shows creation, eh? That little photo at the bottom there with the woman holding the baby up and her sitting on Turtle Island and having grandmother moon and grandfather sun there because they're part of our creation teachings and how they what the roles and responsibilities are in regards to that. So it is possible to heal these through returning and activating your blood memory. So sacred knowledge, wanted to share a little bit about that. In our language, we say that in my language, we say minigoziwan, which are gifts we receive from creation, from that spiritual realm. And to the way it's been explained to me, when we're being gifted that way through Miniguziwan, which is an ancient lawmaking process, it's our original knowledge that is gifted to us through Gijemanitu, that good and kind-hearted spirit, and many other spiritual beings. There's too many for me to even say, and there's more that I probably don't even know, but they're there, and I trust them to be there. And sacred knowledge is carried by both the teacher and the learner. I'm still a learner. Some people call me a teacher. So I'm both of those. And I'll be a learner as long as I'm living here on this physical realm. I'll know everything once I get to that spiritual realm. But right now, I don't know too much. That sacred knowledge is held in trust by those who carry it. And I say all of us carry it. Doesn't matter what age you are, you're both a teacher and a learner. I always say when my granddaughter was born, she became my greatest teacher the moment she was born. The moment she was born, and I seen her. It's also translated across generations and can be usable in today's contemporary world. In fact, I've heard many, many people say that our knowledge, indigenous knowledge, can help any human of the human family return to wellness. Our ways can help in that way. It's also valid and credible, because it goes right back to creation, and it's held in trust in our lodges and our spiritual leaders, and we know that to be valid and credible. And what we say is that indigenous and Western knowledge, it's equal like this. They're not in competition with one another. They can walk side by side like that. So that's where our blood memory comes from, this sacred knowledge. So that's all I had to share. I think there was one more picture, but I can't get to that. Oh, I wanted to share. This is the whole point of what I'm sharing with you is to renew human beings to return to that balance, which is to look after our holistic wellness. So as doctors, you take great care of our physical needs, you tend to that really good. But remember, we also need spiritual needs. We also need emotional. We also need intellectual, all of that. So always remember that that's holistic wellness. And the photo on the left, that's my grandmother and her sister, my maternal grandmother. Their names were Niga Nasamuk and Kijabaitamuk. That was their names. And these two are my descendants. I'm their descendant as well, but I'm kind of in the middle. These are my two grandchildren. And there's their blood memory. They both have long hair with their braids. One is a boy and one is a girl. That's how they identify. And there they are in their regalia. One is a jingle dress dancer and one is a grass dancer. So that's their blood memory being activated, and that's what will help them with their holistic wellness. So that's what I wanted to share. It's all about our children, what we do. It's all about them. And not only are my children, my grandchildren, all our children from the human family. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. So miigwech.
Shimigwech, Sherry, that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So with that wonderful intro, we'll move over to Dr. Brandy Wicklow from the Department of Pediatric Endocrinology.
Thank you. Let's just see if this will work for me. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much. And miigwech, Sherry, that is incredible. It's we are always blessed to be learners of yours. And obviously the partnership that we've been able to have and maintain over the last several years working with the kids in our clinics, but also in our research in terms of trying to improve the health of children with type 2 diabetes has tremendously evolved because we have had the benefit of being educated by elders like Sherry. So thank you, and thank you for that. I'm just going to take you back to try and explain a bit why we're sort of side by side, hand in hand, trying to tackle this issue. And so what does sort of blood memory and Anishinaabe science translate into when you're talking about maybe more Western approaches and the way we look at the kids that we take care of from a Western lens. So this is our province of Manitoba. This is what has happened over time. And thank you for Dr. Sellers to provide me with this slide of the rates up until about 2018. So you can see this is 2006 to 2008. We had an incidence of type 2 diabetes in Manitoba that was just over 12 children per 100,000. And that doubled in 2009, and we were looking at about 28 children per 100,000. And then by 2017, 2018, we're looking at about 34 children per 100,000. So it works out to be about a 300% increase in the number of children affected or afflicted with type 2 diabetes over the course of what's really a decade, just over a decade of time. And this is everybody in Manitoba. And to give you a benchmark of what we used to call childhood onset diabetes, which is type 1 diabetes, in Manitoba, we're about 25 to 30 per 100,000 children. So that's the incident rate of type 1 diabetes. So you can see type 2 diabetes has just eclipsed that. It is the predominant diabetes for children in our province right now. And if you look at the First Nations population being, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population of Manitoba, the incidence in First Nations children is 155 per 100,000. So that's the highest rates that have ever been reported for this particular disease in children. And so, with the average being 33 per 100,000, if the majority of them are First Nations children, then about 6 per 100,000 is the risk in non-First Nations children, or the incidence in non-First Nations children. So along with Sherry, obviously there are other people that are helping us learn how to care for these children and how to address this very significant issue of type 2 diabetes. And so, there are other group members of the DREAM team and other elders that have been involved, and Barb and Clarence, Barry LaValle, obviously, a very close friend of our team, but also a mentor of mine, Francis Desjardins. This was a picture of Jackie McKee, but it didn't turn out. And then there's a lot of other team members that I've worked with, myself and Alison Dart and Dr. Sellers and Meaghan Jones on another study, which I think Meaghan's going to show you a little bit of data from as well, just in terms of epigenetics. The other person who really sort of helped us understand this in terms of the intergenerational impact is Heather Dean. So she's kicked off our Insulin 100 webinar series. And if you missed her Q&A with John, I think it might be recorded. It was fantastic. But Heather first recognized that kids were getting this type of diabetes back in the 80s and early 90s. And one of the first children that she diagnosed is this lady on the right-hand side with her family. And I used the picture with approval from her. She unfortunately passed away several years ago now, but her children and her friends have been longstanding supporters of the research that we do. And she certainly was a strong woman who believed very much that we could move the needle and improve the lives of children, including her children living with type 2 diabetes. So that's Mary Jane Wood and her children here. But Heather met Mary Jane and then noticed that, you know, over the course of her career, 4 out of the 5 of Mary Jane's children developed type 2 diabetes as young as 6 years of age and up until 10 years of age. And it caused us to sort of pause and say, well, is that why the numbers are going up so much over time? Is that every woman who has diabetes has a risk to her own offspring that's higher than the baseline risk of having their children have diabetes. And you can see that here in the graph in the middle. So I think the takeaway point here is really that First Nations families are disproportionately affected for all of the reasons that Sherry shared with us, and I'll share some more. And that women with type 2 diabetes are much more significantly affected, their offspring are much more significantly affected than children of moms who have gestational diabetes. So in general, what that sort of project showed is that if you have a woman who doesn't have diabetes, then there's a risk perhaps that her child will develop diabetes. So maybe 1 out of 10 of her children, if she had 10 children. And if that same woman was diagnosed with gestational diabetes, that the risk to her children would be a bit more, and in fact, perhaps double, so that 2 out of her 10 children might develop diabetes. But if that same woman had type 2 diabetes in her pregnancy, then the risk is much higher to her children. And so you can see here now 6 out of 10 of her children, or 60%, would develop diabetes. And so there's a proportionate increase in risk by exposure that we've seen. And there's also a predominance of girls developing type 2 diabetes. And so not only is there something about the timing of diabetes in pregnancy, because you could say, well, diabetes in pregnancy is diabetes in pregnancy. Clearly it isn't. Gestational diabetes is the diabetes that women are diagnosed with in sort of mid-gestation, somewhere around usually 25, 26 weeks when they have their OGTT. Type 2 diabetes pre-existing is usually a diabetes that's there before conception or at the beginning of conception. So that timing is probably plays a bit of a role. But not only that, there's a difference as to the timing of development of diabetes in their children. So for a mom who did not have diabetes in pregnancy, if she has 1 young girl out of 10 who develops diabetes, that young girl, let's say, would most likely develop diabetes at the average age of 15. So as a teenager, which is the typical age of developing type 2 diabetes in childhood. But if the mom had gestational diabetes, that same mom, her same girl might develop diabetes at age 11. And if that mom had type 2 diabetes in pregnancy, the same mom, and we had one of her girls diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, that would happen at age 8. So there's also a decreasing age risk dependent on the type of diabetes. And so just by looking at this, you can see that now there's 4 girls born to this mom with type 2 diabetes who now have type 2 diabetes at age 8 before they start their own families. And now you can start to understand the intergenerational impact of diabetes, sort of begetting diabetes within a family, and how devastating that is to families, and also challenging to families, families like Mary Jane Wood and her children. That's part of the impetus for the Next Generation study, which Heather Dean started a long time ago, was to determine if we could figure out where those risks were and how we can reverse those risks or modify those risks so that there's less diabetes, resulting in less children with diabetes, and we can reverse the cycle. And so we're 1,000 million years behind Anishinaabe science in the concepts of the 7 generations, and in sort of how to go backwards in terms of exposures and experiences in these families to help them get back to health and holistic wellness. So the next generation study is studying moms who have what we call pregestational diabetes or type 2 diabetes in pregnancy, dads and the offspring of dads with type 2 diabetes in pregnancy, and then the offspring of moms who don't have any form of diabetes in pregnancy. This is the little onesie that we give out to the families who are participating. And there's a lot of early life exposures that we're looking at in terms of what components are important in that risk that seems to be generated through generations. But one of those is what we call epigenetics, which is what Sherry spoke to as blood memory. And so when you think about a child, you think, well, what is it that puts them at risk? And what we do know is there's something about that exposure to that baby in the womb to type 2 diabetes that increases risk. And there's probably some epigenetic changes that happen in the womb resulting from different environmental exposures that increase the risk. And then there's what happens after the baby's born in terms of environment exposures and diet and feeding that can either reduce risk or increase risk. And there's how all of the organs sort of develop and grow, and whether or not leads to whether or not there's a risk of those children actually developing type 2 diabetes. Now, I think Sherry shared that, in a positive light, that addressing a lot of the issues that have been a part of colonization will return people back to holistic health. And we understand that to be true as well. And so as a Western scientist, how do we look at those sorts of questions? Certainly loss of land results in a loss of connection with food and animals in terms of that very close spiritual connection with what you eat and the act of gathering what you eat. And so diet really doesn't explain this, but certainly can be a part of how we sort of look at the relationship between people and food and land. Culture, as Sherry was talking about, in terms of language and culture, and the impact of things like residential schools on losing that way of knowing or that way of being. And so when we look at the intergenerational impact of sort of the trauma that's happened over time, we can look at it in terms of how has that turned on genes or off genes in terms of risk, and how can we return people back to health and holistic health by trying to help with promoting and advocating for the holistic health approach. So the next generation study now has more than, Yashral, thank you very much, made these graphs for me. I had asked him to for a different purpose, so they're a little bit outdated now, but somewhere around 300 mothers we followed, which is about 300 children. We've screened just over half of those children for type 2. So at age 7, we start to look for early markers to see if we can reverse or prevent the progression of the disease as part of this study. And we've looked at some breastfeeding, which I'm going to go into next in terms of what can we do to mitigate risk. So I will also want to end on a positive note. But this is the cohort so far, and you can see that of all children who are 10 years of age and older in the next gen cohort, about 25% of them have developed diabetes. Older than 12, about 40%, and older than 15, about 60%. So this is one of my last slides. Breastfeeding, which we know is the traditional way of feeding infants, is one of those things that's really been shown to impact the risk of diabetes in the offspring if mom had diabetes. So if you started to breastfeed in hospital, the risks are reduced by 50% in childhood of your child developing type 2 diabetes, and about 20% as we move into those children becoming adults, that they will develop type 2 diabetes in adulthood. If you breastfeed for a longer period of time, so up to a year of age, then you're looking at a reduction of around 75%. So a significant risk reduction for these youth. And we can see that here, just in terms of the reduction if you're breastfed versus not breastfed for women with type 2 diabetes. So it's about 2 times the risk in terms of if you don't breastfeed versus if you do. Whereas in gestational diabetes, there's really no difference. So certainly this is a unique circumstance, but there's a unique way to address it and to help these children and their families with respect to type 2 diabetes in childhood. And that's the end for me. And so I will let Meaghan take over.
Thanks, Brandy. You hear me okay, everybody? Oh, yes, see, not excellent. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Brandy and Sherry for leading into this, but also thanks to John for putting it together. This is, I think, a really fascinating way to start from a really beautiful sort of holistic view. And then Brandy, of course, that was Sherry. Brandy talked about sort of the health impacts, and then I'm the person who sits and looks at DNA. So that idea that Sherry brought earlier about scientists who sit in the lab and look at that spiral, that's me. So now we're going to get really into the nitty gritty. So I came into this study, I'm a newcomer to Manitoba. I've only been here about 3 years. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Here we go. And so I came involved in this work because I'm interested in a really sort of broad question, which is, how can an early life exposure influence your later health? And the key word there is how. We know that this happens. We've seen it now through Anishinaabe science. We've seen it through medical knowledge. We know that these things are connected, but how are they connected? And so that is my interest. That's how I ended up working in this area. And so this area is obviously not new. Anishinaabe people have known this for, as Brandy said, millions and many, many years. But it's really become more popular now in Western science in the last, I'd say, 10 to 20 years. This is a cover on Time magazine from 2010. And the headline here is how the first 9 months shape the rest of your life. So Western science is finally catching up. We're realizing the impact of exposures and environments in the early life period. This, I would argue, is a little too narrow. The first 9 months are not the only times in your early life that are important. It is the accumulation of your family exposures throughout their lives, and as Sherry said, into your ancestors, and also into your childhood. It's not just about pregnancy. One of the limitations here is we have to be very careful to not put all the impact here on moms during pregnancy. There is a lot of surrounding and impactful factors that are not just during that really specific period. So to formalize this in sort of the way we think about this in the Western world, we call it the developmental origins of health and disease. We like to categorize things and give them an acronym, so we call it the DOHAD hypothesis. So this is the idea that exposures and environments in your early life, I've got a list here, there's any number of possible exposures, but things like nutrition, socioeconomic status, systemic racism would absolutely go on this list. Pollutants and cigarette smoke. I do a lot of work with inhaled pollutants, so that's why I always list those. But these kinds of exposures in your early life influence your health later on. We know this. Heart disease, diabetes, asthma is a main interest of mine. But what this requires, this model linking past environments to later life health, requires something like memory. And I love that Sherry talked about the concept of blood memory at the beginning of this, because I like to call epigenetics, which is the field that's what I'm going to talk about today, cellular memory. It's how cells remember past exposures. So what is epigenetics? I'm not going to go into detail about this, don't worry. But again, Sherry beautifully introduced this for me, so where she showed that picture of DNA, that spirally structure of DNA. Sometimes you'll also see DNA expressed as a chromosome. Down at the bottom of that screen, it's a big X blobby thing, right? Sometimes you see DNA expressed in both of those forms. So epigenetics, the molecules and markers and things that are involved in epigenetics, is kind of what helps DNA switch between those two states. If you think of the spirally DNA as on DNA, the condensed X DNA as off DNA, epigenetics is what helps it move in between those two states. And so I study the specific molecules and mechanisms that help those things happen. But again, we're not going to talk about that today. Instead, I want to talk about the model of why I think epigenetics is this form of cellular memory. So I like to use this model of a prism. And Brandy talked about this earlier, that sort of health outcomes are, we talk about risk trajectories, because nothing here is really set in stone. You are not the, your past life experiences, your ancestral experiences, your exposures do not put you on a specific path. They do alter your potential risks. So that's why I like to talk about this. I use a rainbow analogy. This is the full spectrum of possible health outcomes. This is a diabetes talk. So here that health outcome could be diabetes. We use specific cutoffs for diagnosis and clinical treatment, but there is a spectrum of possible outcomes that are possible. So how do you get a rainbow? One of the ways you can get a rainbow is by shining a light through a prism. And so to extend this analogy a little bit further, the way I like to think about it is if the exposure is the beam of light, this is the thing that you're being exposed to. In this case, that might be maternal diabetes. The prism is your epigenome. This is the sum total of your epigenetic marks. All of them together create that prism. So the combination of the exposure, maternal diabetes, and your DNA and how your DNA works will sort of establish what your possible health spectrum outcomes might be. And the interesting thing about epigenetics is that it's changeable. So that at certain times during development, we think that if your exposure changes, so you're exposed to an environment, your mother's glucose gets out of control during pregnancy due to type 2, that can actually change your epigenetic marks. So now this prism is changing shape. And those marks, in some cases, can stay. They don't always, and that again is this idea of resilience, of improvement. This is not something that is set in stone, but in some cases we can find instances where these epigenetic marks have stayed from a past exposure, and they then alter what your health trajectory might be. They shift that risk spectrum a little bit. And so even in the absence of the exposure, once the exposure has ended, once you're growing up, sometimes that specific trajectory is maintained. So what I look for is those changes in the prism. I'm looking for specific marks in your DNA that are indicative of an exposure you've had in the past and are also associated with a current or future health outcome. And I want to know what those changes are so that we can figure out why those two things are linked together. So to finish off, I'm going to show you one fairly new finding. So Brandy mentioned the eye care study earlier. So this is a Maine and Manitoba study looking at children and early teens who are diagnosed with type 2 at an early age. And so what we have looked at is we wanted to look exactly that. We looked at a specific epigenetic mark, so it's called DNA methylation. And we wanted to find genes that showed these changes, those changes in like the prism shape, these DNA methylation marks, that showed changes associated with both having diabetes yourself and with your mom having type 2 diabetes during the pregnancy in which you were born. And we found 2 of them so far. These 2 genes this is brand new, hot off the presses data. So we're still looking at exactly what they do, what we think their role may be. But we've actually so far found indications that we have epigenetic marks that are associated with mom having diabetes and with the child developing diabetes themselves. So this is how my work comes in to the amazing and beautiful work that's being done with diabetes in these populations in Manitoba. And I'm really thankful for this opportunity and for talking with everybody and the opportunity for us all to be learners today. Thanks, everyone.
That was fantastic. Thank thank you all for just a beautiful overview. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to ask if anyone has questions to put them in the chat. And my first question to you, Sherry, is if you can unmute. We're Western learners. We grew up in Western environments, and Anishinaabe knowledge is new to us. But if we could point ourselves into one direction, in terms of looking at health and well-being for Indigenous youth, where should we be looking? What should we be reading, and where should we go?
I don't know if there's much written about. I think they're starting to write about blood memory people, but what I would do is I would get to know the knowledge holders, the knowledge keepers. Go invite them, go sit with them, and ask them these questions. Like, and do it, of course, in the most respectful and meaningful way, and they'll share with you um, what blood memory is about and how we can all gain wellness from that. So to us, it's really about wellness, and for us as Indigenous people, we know our wellness comes from that holistic connection. Like I heard even the doctors speak about environment, how that has changed drastically, but still you need to work with the land, right? Like to come to know for your own wellness. And we know that science has even studied that, like what they call grounding, and how that energy from the earth helps you, like with your emotional and mental health, but even your physical health. So to me, that's what you would do. Go sit with the people. Go. A lot of our people are really inclusive, as long as those. As long as you know to leave that knowledge and that leadership with those people. It's not that we don't want to share it, but let us keep, how we're holding that sacred knowledge and trust, but we're willing to share it. But it would be like me pretending to be a Western science when I don't really know. That would be irresponsible of me to try and be like Dr. Wicklow or Dr. Jones, because I don't know. I didn't go to school to learn that stuff. I can support their work, but I wouldn't ever try to take over their expertise in that or their knowledge in that. So that's how I'm going to answer that.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'll turn Brandy and Meaghan. So question one, Brandy, you work with a lot of mothers. We're so grateful that they commit all their time to this work. What's one of the things that mothers are asking you as a doctor to try to figure out, and what do they want us to look for to set the course for a health trajectory for their children? And Meaghan, similarly, what about dads? Are dads involved in this epigenetic process? So those are the final two questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I mean, I think, and Sherry pointed this out, it's amazing to me, but the focus is always on the children and the next generation. And so even when I have parents that are having their own struggles and their own health concerns, the issue has always been, what can I do so that my child has the healthiest and happiest life? And, outside of, like Sherry said, there are things I don't advise on because that's not my teachings. But certainly some of the things we talk about is to sort of go through holistic health in terms of the mental health of the family, the support that the mom gets during her pregnancy from her culture, her family, her community, whoever it is that she surrounds herself with for support at that time. Obviously, you know that moms from up north who make up a huge chunk of this population come down to Winnipeg to deliver. And so where's the support going to come from in the city of Winnipeg? How are moms going to get support to do breastfeeding? It's not an easy thing to do. It's quite difficult. And it would be quite difficult if you didn't have your, you know, grandmas, aunties, uncles, other people around you to support you in doing that. So I think part of it is to try and figure out where we can help with support systems. And then the other part of it is they're willing to participate in research, and they're willing to give blood, and they're willing to give urine, and they're willing to bring their kids in for blood because they want us to start to deconstruct what has happened over time and how it's impacted health as an explanation for the disparities, and then to start to really meaningfully address them. So I think that's probably my answer.
So yeah, so about dads, it's something that my world, the epigenetics kind of world, is trying to come to terms with, because when you think about this idea of early life exposures, you automatically think about moms. But there is a lot to be said about influence of dads. So preconception influences as well. So things like, you know, there isn't as much physical contact during the developmental period between dads and children as there is between moms and children. So the scales are different, but there are absolutely influences of paternal lifetime exposures, and postnatally, of course, in the immediate after birth period, then dads have not as much as an influence as moms, but definitely have an impact. We've done some work on dad influences. They're harder to detect. They don't seem to be as strong, but they're definitely there.
Awesome. Thank you. So with that, I just want to thank everyone who's tuned in, and I really want to thank the Children's Hospital Foundation and CHRIM, and particularly our speakers, Elder Copenace, Dr. Wicklow, Dr. Jones from the Department of Biochemistry and Medical Genetics, by the way. Thank you very much. And one thing we didn't mention, but I think we strongly advocate for, Sherry, would be just building on what Brandy said, our efforts to return birthing back to communities so that moms can celebrate these births with their families and connected to their families, and their children can have that epigenetic connection to their land and their language and their culture that we've taken away. And so we put that stick out as a challenge for our governments to commit to restoring that inequity. And with that, I want to just offer everyone a wonderful weekend and a wonderful rest of your summer. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Chimigwich, Mary, Chimigwich, Brandy, Chimigwich, Meaghan. Take care, everyone.